Greetings. I welcome you to this study. We are continuing through our series addressing the National Sunday Law. And in our previous study, we talked about the signs or the conditions that will exist before the enactment of the mark of the beast. The conditions that will exist just before the mark of the beast crisis. And so in this other study, we are continuing through the same series, looking at the conditions that will exist just before the mark of the beast. And in our previous study, what we looked at was, in regards to the climate crisis, the wars, rumors of wars, strife, commotion, and the famines and pestilences. We looked at the financial crisis and everything that will take place in regards to the economy and how the stage is being laid for us to switch from this current economy to a new economic order. So we looked at all those signs in a brief because we didn't go into details because of the shortness of the video that we wanted to put up. So in this study this afternoon, we are going to look at the signs that will exist, or the conditions that will exist not in the world but in the church. In this particular video, we are going to face these things just as they are. We are going to face the reality of our condition. You know, it is not always good to sugarcoat. It is not always good to hide the true condition of the people. And a true minister is not always called to give those smooth messages that are always just comforting people in their condition. We are going to face the real condition as it is, and these are going to indicate to us that we are on the verge of a crisis, the condition of the church just before the mark of the beast. This is what we are going to look at in this video, and we are going to make it brief so that it is easier to watch. Now the Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 10:11, the Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians 10:11, if I can reach there very fast, it says in 10:11, 1 Corinthians, "Now all these things happened unto them for ensamples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come." Now Paul was going through the history of the nation of the Israelites, the history of Israel, when they were delivered from Egypt, from Egyptian bondage, up to when they settled into the promised land. And he is saying that all those things that happened unto them, talking of the apostates and whatever that took place through their journey, was a type, was a shadow, it was an ensample of the end of time. In other words, if we are to get to know what will befall the church just before we enter heavenly Canaan, we are supposed to go back to history and look at the history of the nation of Israel, how they were delivered, what they went through, because they have told us those were written as ensamples or types or shadows of the end. Now, we are going to look at this passage that is in the book of Ezekiel. We're going to start with Ezekiel, but we shall go back to the journey of the Israelites when they were moving from Egypt to the promised land. But let's start with Ezekiel first, and then we shall go back to see how Paul was trying to make the history of the Israelites a shadow of the end. Now in Ezekiel 8, that is where we are going to read. In Ezekiel 8 and partly Ezekiel 9 if we choose to read there. But in Ezekiel 8, Ezekiel was taken into captivity in the second siege of Babylon. That was in 597 BC. And then he was called into the office of the prophet in 592 BC. So when he got these visions, he was in the land of the Chaldeans. And now he's seeing what is taking place in Jerusalem before the third siege, which took place in 586. So he was shown in vision the abominations that were entering into the church, the abominations that were coming in among the professed people of God. And now we read in Ezekiel 8, and I'm going to skip verses, but let me read this. And verse 3, and he put forth the form of an hand, and took me by the lock of mine head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh towards the north. There was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoked unto jealousy. Now Ezekiel sees in vision that what was taking place in Jerusalem, what was taking place among the professed people of God, is that abominations were creeping in among them. And inspiration says that these two chapters, Ezekiel 8 and Ezekiel 9, they will be repeated when it comes to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In other words, we ought to study them. The 9th chapter of Ezekiel ought to be studied, because what transpired in that verse has to take place in the church at the end of time. But remember, the things that take place in Ezekiel 9 have a background of the abominations that are listed before Ezekiel 9. So when we talk about what is to take place just before, we ought to also look at these Old Testament prophecies and see how things transpired pertaining to the church of God then. Verse 6 in Ezekiel 8 says, he said, furthermore unto me, Son of man, seest thou they do, even the great abominations that the house of Israel committeth here. Now you see that Ezekiel is shown abomination after abomination creeping in, not in the world, but in the church. These abominations were coming in among the professed people of God. Now we may not go into the details of the types of abominations here in Ezekiel 8, but my emphasis, or what I want to bring out, is that the abominations were creeping into the church. They were coming in among the professed people of God. That was verse 6. Then verse 9 says, and he said unto me, go in and behold the wicked abominations they do here. More abominations. Verse 13, I said unto me, turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations. In other words, abomination after abominations were coming in the church, in the professed people of God. And I want us to notice in verse 15 of Ezekiel 8 says, then said he unto me, hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than these. Verse 16, and he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshipped the sun toward the east. Now, when these abominations were coming in among the professed people of God, we reached a time when we reached the final abomination. This was the final abomination, that these 25 men had their backs towards the temple, and they were worshipping the sun towards the east. Now, when you read further, you realize that there was no more abomination listed, but God's judgment falling upon Israel, falling upon the professed people of God. In other words, just as Sister White says that the sun worship in these last days, which is Sunday sacredness, Sunday worship by law, will be the final act in the drama. The sun worship in Ezekiel 8:16 is a type of Sunday worship, when Sunday is enforced by law and all are required to abide by that law. Then the parallel of that in the Old Testament is the sun worship. So the sun worship and Sunday worship are linked together. So when we see this in Ezekiel 8:16, that was the final abomination. And the next thing that takes place after that final abomination is that God proceeds to judge his people. God proceeds to judge his people, to mark those that were sighing and crying because of those abominations, and the other who participated in the abominations and who did not receive the mark of deliverance fell by the sword in Ezekiel 9. So what do I want to show here? That before Sunday worship, before sun worship, which is in Ezekiel 8:16, what has taken place among the professed people of God is that we see abominations creeping in, coming in among the professed people of God until we reached the final act in the drama, which was sun worship or Sunday worship in these end times. So abomination after abomination coming in among the professed people of God. And those abominations culminated in sun worship. But notice that those who are worshiping the sun towards the east, their backs were to the temple. They had turned their backs towards the temple. And what do we find in the temple? What do we find in the sanctuary? What we find in the sanctuary, the Bible says in Psalm 77 verse 13, thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Who is so great a God as our God? In other words, the way of salvation, the way of redemption, God's plan to restore man, to save man, is in the sanctuary. So when these people had turned their backs towards the temple, we can apply that. If we are to get the application, we can apply that these people had turned their backs towards God's plan of redemption, towards God's plan of salvation. They had rejected God's plan, which is revealed in the sanctuary, and they ended up worshiping the sun. So in these last days, those who are going to turn their backs towards the message of the sanctuary, towards the message that is revealed in the sanctuary from the courtyard to the most holy place, those that will reject that message, those that will turn their backs towards that message all will receive the mark of the beast. They will end up in false worship. Because God's way, God's method of redemption, God's plan of salvation is in the sanctuary. When we embrace the message of the sanctuary, we are prepared to receive the seal of God. And those who will turn their backs towards that message will end up receiving the mark of the beast. They will end up worshiping the sun. These men had their backs towards the temple. And these were leaders. They were the first to transgress. They were the first to go into such kind of worship. And then the rest followed. That is why the stroke of God began with them. So, the message of the sanctuary, just as we've seen in the previous videos, that if we are to be prepared for the seal of God, the steps to receiving the seal of God are in the sanctuary. Now, when we turn our backs towards that temple, when we turn our backs towards God's way, we shall worship the sun. We shall receive the mark of the beast. Now, these people did that. But my point of emphasis in this video is that abominations were coming in among God's people, until the final act in the drama, which was sun worship. And when that came, God proceeded to judge his people, proceeded to mark and to destroy. There was the final sifting of the judge. It took place at the final act in the drama, sun worship. God now proceeded to sift finally those who had the mark and those who did not have the mark. God proceeded to judge his people. But notice what we want to try, what we want to come up with, or what we want to reach to is what will be the condition before the mark of the beast. What will be the condition of the church? What will be the condition among the professed people of God just before the mark of the beast, just before Sunday law? And we've seen, according to the model of Ezekiel 8, that we shall see abominations creeping in among the professed people of God. That is what we want to establish in this video. And in our next study, we are going to look at some of these abominations and see whether they are actually taking place among the professed people of God. Now, mark this, and let me qualify it. We are dealing with God's true church. We are dealing with God's true movement. We are dealing with God's end-time movement at this particular stage in history, when it is still the church militant, when the wheat and tares are still together, when we have the wise and the foolish virgins still together. We are dealing with God's end-time remnant. This is not that we are rendering this as not God's true remnant. No, this is the remnant of God, but the type in the Old Testament shows us that just before we cross into the heavenly Canaan, such abominations will creep in among them, and God will intervene to sift his church, to purify his church, and those who will participate in those abominations will end up receiving the mark of the beast and will not make it to the heavenly Canaan. So what we want to establish is that we don't want to give people carnal security that so long as you are just a member, whatever you do is approved of heaven. So long as you are just part of this end-time movement, whatever is transpiring or whatever you participate in is approved of heaven. I want to tell you that not all that is being done is approved of heaven. The devil has planted in tares amongst the wheat, and they are working for the destruction of God's people. They are working for the destruction of God's people. The tares are the fruit of the embodiment of error, of false principles. That is according to Crisis Object Lessons, page 71. So those things are happening amongst us. Very many things are happening in our midst. And those are indications that we are close to the mark of the beast. God is about to sift his church. We are in the time of the shaking. Two classes are developing. We can see a class that is purifying their lives, and we can see another class that is working against that. But God will intervene, and God will purify his church. The church that is going to finish the work is not this church militant. It will be the church triumphant. God will sift it. In our next video, let us look at those abominations and we see whether that is taking place right now, so that we can be assured that we are actually living just at the verge of that crisis.